tonight my guest is very special, Roger Waters. Roger, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask you, what goes through your mind when you're performing The Wall?
Do you know, what's that really old joke? What's the last thing that goes through a fly's mind when it hits the windscreen? It's arsehole. That isn't what goes through my mind. But when I'm doing it, I'm not really thinking very much. I'm just connecting.
But you talked about the mathematics of music that affects, you know, our physiology, and how it creates an emotional response. What kind of response do you want to get from the crowd?
I just want them to be moved, by any piece of theatre.
But is the response from you inevitably drawn back to and always shaped by the death of your father?
Well, that's certainly a big part of it, yeah. If you come and see this version of The Wall, it's much broader politically, philosophically and emotionally than the original version was in 1979. If there's any of you still alive who saw that show. And so the empathy that I feel for people who lose loved ones in war and other political conflicts is born out of the pain that I felt at the loss of my father. There's no question. It's an important contributory factor.
And was part of the healing process for you when like you realised your father had died in a just war?
Oh, that's an interesting point. Do you know, I think all over the United States, and I suspect in the UK as well, I've at half-time, I have veterans. In America, it was Wounded Warrior Project, and so like 20 or so wounded veterans come to the show every night, and at half-time I go and see them and talk to them, and so on and so forth. And most of them are from Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously, which, as far as I'm concerned, neither of those. So there's no justice in those conflicts, but the pain of the loss of the young men or women who are lost in it. It doesn't make any difference, really, whether it's just or not. That's something that I've kind of learned over the time. So when I meet these guys, and they're always big Pink Floyd fans, you know, and the music has meant a lot to them over the years, whatever their political leanings may be. The politics is kind of irrelevant. It's just inclusion. It's just here we don't need to talk about politics. We don't need to talk about the rights and wrongs of this thing, except that we all sort of intuitively understand that the loss of life that we see happening every day, whether it's in Libya or, you know, or in Afghanistan or whatever, is almost certainly in most cases unnecessary. But this is my political view. This isn't the view of the veterans who come, but it's probably triggered by other motives. It's triggered by fear. So, and the fear that we all feel, and that we can very easily be goaded into fearing the evil ones, the others, the ones on the other side.
The people who get demonised,
Yeah, you demonise people and you build a wall between one culture or one ideology or one religion and another, and demonise anybody who is other, who's on the other side of it. And fundamentally, that's all this show is about.
Isn't it essentially, without being oversimplistic, your father died in a just war, and the world has learned nothing since. All the wars, I don't know what are they about? What are we killing people for?
Well, I have very extreme views on this, and I'm rather anti-extremism. But do you know what? I think that a number of times we get involved in conflicts for no apparent reason, like let's impose a no-fly zone on Libya, is because the business community needs to dump weapons, to dump some bombs on somebody, to sell more munitions. It's extraordinary how large a part of our economies in the West, certainly in England and France and the United States, and also in the USSR, is built upon the idea that we have a big armaments industry and we need to be selling this shit to other people. And really, we, by and large, don't give a who it's used on, so long as we can sell it, you know, and so we can keep that chain and jobs depend on it. And that may be a very cynical point of view. It's
probably not cynical enough, though.
It was a point of view that I expressed very, very strongly in the Radio Chaos shows that I did with David Munro, who was a filmmaker who worked with John Pilger, and he worked with me. He's dead now, sadly. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. But I'll never forget John Pilger's voiceover saying, we, the nations who sell arms, fuel wars because we want to. We want wars to happen. It's important to us. And I think it's important to certain politicians as well. Certainly, for instance, it was clearly very important to Margaret Thatcher that the Falklands War happened, that Hague wasn't allowed to settle any differences, that there was no diplomatic way. She needed that war or she was out. So in my view, it's only my view, but in my view, all those young servicemen and women were, both Argentine and English, were sacrificed upon the altar of Margaret Thatcher's ambition.
Can I ask you, how do we stop hatred being passed on from generation to generation?
Well, I like to think that what I'm doing might be, in some small way, contributing to that, because I make the point constantly that your religion and probably your political ideology is defined by the geography of your birth.
Yeah.
You know, so if you're born into a religious family in
what was your religion?
Tehran. Well, my father was a devout Christian.
And he was a conscientious...
and he was a conscientious objector on those grounds, but he then decided that his conscientious objection was trumped by the Nazi menace to the world, and he joined the Communist Party, and I'm sure he's remained a Christian, though I never got to ask him that question. My mother was brought up in a middle-class Christian family in Golders Green, surprisingly, in North London.
There's a big Jewish community there, isn't there?
There's a big Jewish community, but she then... what happened to her was she matriculated from a girls' boarding school, went to teacher training college, became a teacher, and she did her teacher training in Bradford through the winter of 1935 or 36, a hard winter, and there was something she couldn't stomach about half the children in her class walking to school through the snow with no shoes. And she you know, in Golders Green it didn't happen, but it happened in Bradford. Where
so she became left-wing.
And she
naturally.
went, wow, this is wrong. There's something really wrong with this picture. And it's all about the haves and the have-nots, and it's all about how we deal with...
But that was 34. It's like here we are. How many years later? Nothing's changed.
You may well be right. If you were to go to my website rogerwaters.com and read "Why are you doing the wall now?"
No, I just saw it up on your concert, up on the pictures. You know, the haves and the have-nots, the people with clothes. And
well, there's all that. But on my website it says, I just came across an interview I did 25 years ago where I say the most important question facing us all now is, will the development of technology and the exchange of information, i.e. Facebook, turn of the internet, all of that, serve as a tool to help to bring we human beings, born as we are and affected by the geography of our birth, and definitely help to bring us closer together and increase the possibility for us to empathise with one another? Or will it be subdued by the very, very few, very, very rich people who run the northern, western, rich countries, although we think that they don't, they actually do, in my view, and will be used as an agent of control to keep us under control, so that we just keep consuming and we don't actually think about any of these questions that you're bringing up. Now, it may be that if we can keep twittering, keep talking to each other, keep going to the show, keep whatever, keep thinking, keep alive to the thought that maybe maybe there is something beyond commerce. If we live in Western civilized society, then maybe there is a light somewhere at the end of the tunnel. That
Could I ask you, Roger, how did you knock down the walls that you built up in yourself? You were very alienated young man, angry, feeling guilty about your father. How did you get over that? I mean, was it 20 years of therapy, and do you ever leave?
Yeah, a lot of that. But, you know, there were much more complicated questions about it. It was much more about women and who, you know, and giving power to women. And
but was it true your mum, like, she sounds like a really interesting woman, left-wing.
She was a great woman.
She wanted, she wanted you to go out and find dirty girls, and she wanted it to be, you know, what did she want for her son?
She really, this was her chief ambition, was that I should not become a travelling salesman because I had no education. Yeah. That was her. She had a friend or friends who, like, didn't manage to get themselves educated to the point where they didn't have to go and sell toothbrushes.
Yeah.
And she thought that was beyond her, beyond the pain of death for her, was the idea that somebody with intelligence would have to live their life with no qualifications and therefore having to do a boring job. That was the worst thing that she could imagine, which is cool, actually. That's why, and that's why she devoted her entire life to educating the young.
Yeah.
And that's why I couldn't be more pro-education.
I was reading a really old interview you did. It must have been like in the early 80s of Rolling Stone or something. That line about the lunatic fat woman who's whipping the teacher. Was that when you were in school and this teacher was always very sarcastic to you and you were fantasizing that when he got home that his wife would kick the shit out of him? Yeah.
I mean, you know, they're all dead now, but a lot of the teachers said, I was talking about a very, very rigid boys' grammar school. It was called the Cambridge High School for Boys.
Yeah.
You know, like in the late 50s and early 60s. And it was very hidebound, and they were sort of pretending that they were a public school, but they weren't. It was a state school, and so they couldn't wield, you know, the power that maybe was wielded in the public school hierarchical system. But nevertheless, what they were interested in the Cambridge High School for Boys was gaining university entrances. Nothing wrong with that, but they did it in a way where they said, you can only do this if we exercise our control over you, and you do as you're told, and you don't answer back, and we're not interested in conversations.
Really?
Yeah.
How did your mother feel about that?
About that particular... Well, she would have disapproved of that. My mother was educated at the Froebel Institute in Roehampton in London, and it must have been somebody called Froebel. I've never read it.
What was the philosophy?
The philosophy was that you should educate children by interesting them in a subject. So there was a thing when I was at primary school in England, which my mother may well have introduced to the school I was at, called Centre of Interest. And so you would have a project about making bread or, you know, or sheep farming in Australia. And so you would go, wow, that's interesting. How does that work? And so it's the idea that you don't make children sit down and learn something. You say to them, look at this. This is interesting. Check this out. What do you think of this? How would you do that differently? Or how might you do this? You know. So you have to, that was the whole Froebel Institute thing. It was revolutionary at the time.
As a young child, because I know The Wall is a lot about fear, were you gulping down fear as a young child because you were aware that your father was never there?
Gulping?
Well, like literally, like, you know, like fear almost, you know, like it was inside you, like coming down like that.
No, I don't think so. But after umpteen years of therapy...
But you didn't know what it was?
No, after umpteen years of therapy, I finally realised that a recurrent dream that I had where I was terrified that I had murdered somebody and that I was going to get caught. I stopped having that dream when I realised it. I thought I'd killed my father when I was a tiny baby.
Wow.
Because...
Was that you buried?
It's well known that young children always feel themselves responsible for their parents' divorce, and they feel themselves responsible if they're young enough for the death of a parent or the what. But infants and very young children tend, because they feel they're the centre of the universe, to take responsibility for anything that happens around them.
Was it painful to write the wall? I mean, it's not light stuff. I mean, it's incredibly... I mean, my father died a year and a half ago, and even watching it tonight, it was just quite very upsetting, but
yeah,
in a good way. I know it's not all about that.
Yeah. But I mean, I went through a lot of times around that time. Yeah. Listen, got to go and see the band.
Well, what about Sid is in that as well? I mean, that line about the rubber bands and the shoes.
What about it? Oh, Sid, yeah. Elastic Band, yeah.
What's your memories of him?
Oh, well, they're very, very varied, obviously. Yeah. He was, although he was a couple of years younger than me, we became close friends when we were teenagers. And then we were in a band together for a sort of very short time, and then he went crazy. You know, he was a schizophrenic, and...
Yeah. Could he not? There was no way you could help him?
No, I did everything that I I could to help him. No, he was... No, I couldn't help him.
Can I just ask you one thing? There was an old interview you did where, you know, the telephone conversation that was...
Yeah.
Did you catch your first wife having an affair and you rang up and you cut some guy out?
No, that's... No. No, I found out that she'd been having an affair and blah, 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 that. But that was different. That was in a conversation between me and her. What I did was, I thought, wouldn't it be good if we could create this theatrical thing whereby Pink is calling home and the telephonist, the operator, realises what's going on. So I set that up. So I'm sitting in a room in Los Angeles, and I've got James Guthrie sitting in a room in London, and I just kept calling him again and again and again. And I would tell the operator, I want to make a collect call to Mrs. Floyd from Mr. Floyd from Los Angeles, da, 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 da. And finally we got that woman. That is real.
Yeah.
That is a real telephone operator in America who just got the story, and so it's amazing. It's a fabulous piece of real work. Except it wasn't real.
Does Gilmour, when he plays your music, does he get it?
And now you'd have to ask him that.
Well, you said in 1990 in Rolling Stone that you've heard them at Nebworth, and it just from what you felt, that he didn't understand what the songs were about.
Well, maybe I
have you changed your opinion?
I've no interest in talking about that.
Yeah. What's the biggest misconception people have about Roger Waters?
What?
What's the biggest misconception you think people have about you?
I don't know. You'd have to tell me. You're in the media. I don't know. I don't go and ask people.
But like you, it was an incredible show. I mean, you must be drained after that.
I am, yeah. That's why I'm going to see the boys in the band.
I'll see you in Dublin. Thanks very much, Robert.
No, thank you for coming. Encourage them to come and see it.
I know. I'm sure they'll come in their droves anyway.
Oh, good.
All right. Listen. Thanks
very
much.
Man. Cheers.